All right, welcome everyone to our second live webinar. Today is all about settling puppies into their new homes. But before we get started, if I could please ask everyone to make sure that their cameras are turned off, that you've muted yourself, and we will be having some Q&As at the end. So if you're on your laptop, you will see the Q&A up the top. And if you're on your phone, you'll see the three little dots and you'll see the Q&A tab. Please put your questions through and we'll get our guest speaker to answer them at the end. But it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Tamara Jackman. Tamara is the owner of Underdog Training and Behaviour Consulting, a Melbourne-based dog training service established in 2005. With 20 years experience, she is a highly respected dog trainer and behavioural consult who specialises in helping puppies and adult dogs become confident, responsive companions. Tamara works closely with owners to strengthen their communication, improve skills, and build a deeper understanding of their canine companions. Her practical, supportive approach has helped countless families build strong foundations during the early stages of puppy development. Please join me in welcoming Tamara Jackman.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I really do appreciate that. Today we are delving into everything related to bringing a new puppy home. I'm lucky enough to have some recent personal experience here, as well as my professional experience, having welcomed a new puppy home recently. And I do think sometimes it's important to have that recent experience, because if you haven't lived with a puppy for a while and you haven't been through that puppy development 24/7, you haven't lived it recently, sometimes doing it again gives you this sort of renewed empathy for what new puppy owners are dealing with and going through. So today I hope to give you a lot of information about what we can do to make puppy ownership a really positive and pleasurable experience for puppy owners as well as for the puppies. So I'm going to talk about what's ideal today, or what I think is ideal today, with the understanding that sometimes what's ideal is not achievable. So if we know what's ideal, then we have something to reach for, and it doesn't mean that we can't make the necessary adjustments or concessions when we need to. But I think having things to really strive for in terms of ideal puppy foundations is just a really important thing for us to be able to do. Whilst we're talking about puppies today, a lot of the concepts that we talk about are the same for older or adult dogs as well. The difference with puppies is that they learn faster, they generalise behaviour more readily to different contexts, and generally speaking, less repetitions are required than with an older dog who's been rehearsing certain behaviours for a longer period of time. So why is learning during that puppy period so important? We train older dogs all the time, but if I could get to them all as puppies, I absolutely would, because it would mean I could get to them in their critical period of socialisation. So critical period of socialisation is up until 16 weeks of age. I consider puppies to be like a little sponge for learning during that time, so they soak everything up. But I think it's also important, before we go into some detail about that critical period of socialisation, and what we should be doing there, to also acknowledge that not all sponges are the same and not all puppies are the same. So we have to recognise that the genetic makeup of the puppy that an owner starts with is actually really important. So what breed are they? What lines within a particular breed are they? And what behaviours is that individual puppy genetically predisposed to? As trainers, sometimes we can make ourselves a bit unpopular when we talk about these things, especially when we talk about behaviours that are maybe considered less desirable personality and temperament traits. And there's definitely a mantra that goes around a lot. It's all about how you raise them. And I think whilst we're going to talk a lot today about how you raise them and how important that is, so I'm not diminishing that, that mantra just isn't entirely true. Puppies are not blank slates when somebody brings them home at 8 or 9 or 10 weeks of age. We've got the genetics that lay behind that puppy, and we've also got the first 8, 9, 10 weeks of age that have been spent with the breeder as well. So that's half of that puppy's critical period of socialisation that has already been started before the owner gets the puppy. And then, of course, what the owner does next is important from that point. onwards. So the best example that I can give to people and the best explanation in terms of, well, why does genetics matter? I often say to people, if I had a farm and I had a whole lot of cattle on that farm, what kind of dog am I going to get to help me herd my cattle? I'm going to go and get most likely an Australian cattle dog, maybe a Kelpie, less likely a Border Collie. But there's some dogs that I'm absolutely not going to go and get. I'm not going to go and get a pug. I'm not going to go and get a greyhound, and I'm not going to go and get a Labrador. And that's because all of those different breeds have different genetic predispositions to different behaviours, right? So a lot of different behavioural traits can be inherited. So we think about it with that sort of herding dog example, and we know it to be true, but there are a lot of other traits that also can be inherited wholly or partially. Things like the dog's level of drive, their level of energy and the activity that they require, their boldness and timidity, their need and desire for company as well. So how they cope when they're on their own, their degree of independence. There's a really good saying that I like when it comes to the relationship between genetics and early socialization. And we say genetics loads the gun, environment pulls the trigger. So even though we're talking a lot about socialisation, we want to remember that what an owner starts with, we hope that once they get the puppy that they've done the appropriate research and chosen something with the genetics that's most likely to suit them, because that's going to give them the best possible chance of having a great life with their dog and bring all of the benefits that dog ownership can bring. I think it's also worthwhile remembering, I know there's probably quite a few people here who have multi-dog homes, including myself, and it is important to remember that there are dogs that will behave quite differently and puppies that will cope quite differently in single dog homes versus multi-dog homes as well. So sometimes we hear from clients that they're having trouble with their puppy or they're having trouble with their dog, and they speak with their breeder, or maybe they speak with their vet, and they're asking about these sort of behaviours that they're getting and why they're getting these behaviours. And sometimes the breeders are saying, hang on a second, our dogs don't behave like that. And nobody's lying in that situation. Everybody's being truthful, but they just have two very different contexts that they're expecting these puppies and young dogs to live within. So if you take the same puppy or the same dog and put them in 10 different homes, you can get 10 different sets of behaviour depending on what that home contains and what other animals are within that home, what people are within that home. So it's important to remember that sometimes, so that we don't think that the way that a dog behaves in our home is going to be the same when that dog or that puppy is placed into an entirely different home. So critical period is up until 16 weeks of age, and it is quite literally a critical period for socialisation. So a dog's brain undergoes very rapid transformation during that time. Puppies that are socialised well during their critical period of socialisation are more functional. They're more likely to be well-adjusted adults and have more successful relationships, not just with their owners, but also with other animals in the community that they come into contact with. In a nutshell, well-socialised puppies tend to have better lives, more free and full lives as they go forward into adulthood. However, the practical application of socialisation, I feel, has really been a bit distorted over the last decade or so. And we actually now have more socialisation related problems than ever before, which is quite incredible when I think about the knowledge that we have, the access to different resources that we have. I think the dog owning population knows that they need to socialise their puppy. They understand that socialisation is really important, but they're just actually not sure how to do it. They don't know the mechanics of how to do it. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today and try and clear up some things in terms of what good quality socialisation should look like and what poor quality socialization looks like, because they have dramatically different outcomes. So it's not just a matter of you should socialize your puppy or socialization is important. We actually want to be shooting for that really high quality socialization, because that's the thing that makes a massive difference to those eventual outcomes in that dog. So what is socialization, right? So we've probably all got a bit of a picture in our mind of what socialization is, but I just want to define it a little bit more. So socialization is about exposure to the world, specifically the things that a dog is going to encounter during their life, while simultaneously developing productive ways to feel and behave during those exposures. So it's not just about having the exposure, it's about how the dog feels, or how the puppy feels during the exposure, and how they feel then drives the behavior that we get as a result of that. With puppies, we're generally socializing them with things that are new to them, that they've never seen before. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important that we get those early exposures right, because the puppy has no pre-developed associations with the things that we're exposing them to. They might never have seen or experienced a certain sight, smell, type of person before. They're having those things for the first time. So because of that, we want socialization to be done in a systematic sort of way, and we want control over the outcome wherever it's possible for us to do so. So it's not about having these sort of free-for-all type situations. Sometimes people are thinking that in order to socialize their puppy, that they're taking them down to the dog park, or they're taking them down to their friend's place and just letting them run wild with another dog. That's not what we mean when we talk about socialization from a training perspective. We want these controlled, structured situations, and we actually also need time to do that. So one of the things that time gives us when we're socializing puppies, so not being in a rush, is it allows us to create variation of behavior. And variation of behavior is really important, especially when it comes to actual social experiences, whether that be with people, with other dogs, or with other animals. So we don't want to end up with a dog that thinks every time they see another dog that it's going to be high intensity, high arousal play. We actually want them to have a huge variety of behaviours. And for those of you that have multi-dog homes, you will almost organically get some of this variation, just because you've got dogs that are spending many, many hours with other dogs. They're not playing the whole time. Once you take dogs and you put them into single dog homes, though, we have to structure things a little bit more carefully and a little bit more clearly to ensure that we get that same sort of variation, because otherwise we have this sometimes novelty type effect where they see another dog, they see another puppy, and they think, oh my God, it's playtime. And if they've only got an hour or so to do that, you're not likely to get variation of behaviour unless you create it as the handler. So that's what we want owners to be doing when they're socialising their puppies, really being an engaging and interactive participant in the socialisation, rather than this idea of sort of being stepped back and letting the puppy socialise on their own. We want to actually be manipulating things a little bit in a really positive way. We also have to understand that when we are exposing puppies, what we're doing is we are starting to desensitize them to all of the things that they're going to encounter in the world. And whenever there is a possibility for desensitization, there is also a possibility for sensitization. And we don't necessarily know what individuals are going to desensitize versus what individuals are going to sensitize. And again, that's why we have to be careful about the exposures that we create. There might be one puppy that can cope actually really well with a very overwhelming situation where there's 5 puppies in a room and they all get let off lead and they go crazy together. But of those 5 puppies, there's also going to be another puppy in the room that does not cope well with that, that sensitizes, becomes more sensitive in that situation, having had that experience. So we want to avoid sensitization, and one of the ways that we can do that is by controlling the environments that we actually put puppies into, and helping puppies to feel and then behave in particular ways as we expose them. So socialization should include seeing, observing, and interacting with. So that's really important. Seeing, observing and interacting, not necessarily in the same experience. So they don't always have to interact with something to be socializing. Seeing something, observing something is just as important, and I would argue probably even more important, given that as people we tend to naturally lean in the direction of interaction, right? So we want them to see, observe, and or interact with a great variety of dogs, people, and other animals. Other animals, I think, is actually quite important. It's often overlooked as well. So people say, well, if I don't have a cat, for instance, in my home, I'm not going to socialise my dog with small animals. I think if it's available to you and you're able to do it, it's actually incredibly useful, so that we end up with dogs that have really broad-ranging social skills. Seeing and observing a variety of machinery, vehicles, household appliances. Some of these things will happen organically just by the puppy living in the home, and some of them we're going to need to go out of our way to actually introduce puppies to. One of the advantages of having children in a home with a puppy, there are some disadvantages too, but one of the advantages is that children often tend to have items that are noisy and novel and do unusual things. And one of the things that we find is that with puppies that are being raised in very calm, quiet adult homes, a lot of those puppies struggle with novelty and they struggle with noise because they don't live with it, right? So in those situations, that person, that puppy owner is going to need to go out of their way to create that kind of exposure. The person with children in the home, they're going to have some other challenges, right? So they're going to need to make sure that they do things like ensuring the puppy has enough time to sleep, ensuring that the children are interacting with the puppy in a very appropriate way. So it's not that it's challenge free, but different challenges exist in different households. And when we're socializing puppies, we're trying to look at, well, what naturally exists in the household already? And what do we need to actually actively seek out to socialise our new puppy with? We also want to make sure that we've exposed puppies to a variety of different surfaces, so different things to walk on, different stability and different traction. So making sure that they can actually move over a slippery floor, or they can actually walk over something that moves slightly and safely underneath their feet. Exposure to veterinary and grooming experiences and the associated restraints that come with that. So sometimes puppies might be great at going into the vet clinic and getting a treat, but as soon as a stranger puts their hands on them and needs to get them to be still for something, we have a bit of a problem. So that exposure to restraint is also a massive part of what we need to do, and exposure to a variety of what I call dynamic environments. So environments that change all the time, even within the one exposure. So things like sporting events, markets, carnivals, busy places that are always changing. Less confident puppies require greater distance from the objects of socialization. So as we're going through these processes and we're exposing puppies to different things, we have to make sure that we're actually looking at the puppy's body language and getting an idea as to how they feel about being in that situation. Because when we have puppies that are less confident, they not only need a greater distance, but they usually need more time to become confident before they leave a situation as well. So leaving a situation when a puppy is timid or fearful will sensitize them. So think about sort of a common example. A puppy comes into the vet clinic. They first come into the vet clinic and they're really worried, and then they stay worried for the entirety of the time that they're at the vet clinic, and they leave and they're still worried. That's not going to have been a helpful experience for them to come next time. It's one of the reasons, and was actually the original reason why puppy preschool classes in veterinary clinic environments were really developed. And what we find in puppy preschool classes is the puppies come along and in week one at the very beginning, we might have some of those shy or reserved or timid puppies, right? Because we have this sort of spectrum of confidence, this spectrum of boldness or timidity, and you can have a puppy that's just reserved, right? Reserved is neither good nor bad, it's just reserved. It's kind of right in the middle. So we get plenty of reserved puppies, we get a few shy puppies, and we get a few puppies that are timid or fearful. And they start their first class that way. And what we do is we manage the class in a way that by the end of the first class, the puppy feels better than how they started, right? So they don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be bouncing around with all the other puppies, but they need to feel better than how they started. And then what happens is when they come back for week 2, that's their sort of starting point. How they finished in week 1, that's their starting point in week 2. And so over 4 weeks or 6 weeks or however long our puppy class at the vet clinic is, we've got these puppies that are just gradually becoming braver and braver in that veterinary clinic environment. That's a very different situation to a puppy maybe going in for a vaccination, for example, and they go in, they feel a bit worried about the situation, they have their vaccination, and then they leave immediately afterwards. So having some time after an examination or after a vaccination to stay in the environment, if it's safe for them to do so, and doing things like giving lots of food rewards, simple play. I understand that you can't have, puppies playing with thrown toys all over the vet clinic reception area, but having them stay in the environment for a little while after vaccination, after examination, until they start to feel a bit better, that's going to be something that's really helpful for those puppies. And if we have a puppy that we think, goodness, this puppy was actually outside that sort of normal range of behaviour, right, for a puppy of whatever age they are. So let's say they're a 12-week-old puppy. If we say, look, this puppy is actually more fearful than average, at that point we would start encouraging the owner to return to the vet clinic purely for socialisation purposes, right? Because if we do that and we manage to do that during that critical period of socialisation, it's going to make a massive difference to how that puppy views the vet clinic for the entirety of their life. So think about critical period socialisation experiences as imprinting, right? Or laying the foundations to a building. Even if they have a bad experience later down the track, if they've got that great foundation that's been laid during their critical period, you will find that they're more resilient to challenges later down the track. And so it becomes really important for those puppies that we identify early as being sort of outside the normal range. And this is where providing these socialisation experiences, it becomes like a diagnostic checklist as well. So, and that's what I encourage owners to do. So use socialisation as a checklist to say, well, what does this individual puppy have trouble coping with? Can I find out about this when I still have 4 or more weeks of critical period left, so that I've got time to work on it while they're still in that very spongy, brain rapidly developing kind of stage? So things like noise sensitivity, touch sensitivity, going into the vet, being left alone. Do I have a puppy that actually mouths people more than the average puppy? And this is sometimes where professional assistance is necessary to help people kind of assess that and step through that. Because if somebody doesn't have experience with a variety of puppies, they're not necessarily going to know what is typical on the spectrum of normal puppy behaviour. And what I'm trying to do is, when I have 5 puppies come for puppy preschool and they're 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 weeks of age, what I'm trying to do is not just get through our puppy preschool content, but also look at, do I have any puppies here that with specific things, they're just outside that normal range? And it is a range. We don't expect them to all be the same. But if I do have puppies that are outside that normal range, what can I do, or what can I start encouraging the owners to do to compensate for that, right? And again, if we're getting to that early, we've got plenty of time. It's much more difficult if I have someone that comes to me with a puppy that maybe is 16, 17, 18 weeks of age, and they say, we've just started to try and leave this puppy alone. We took a whole lot of time off work. We never left the puppy alone. Now we've started to try and leave the puppy alone, and this is a puppy that falls outside that kind of normal range in terms of independence. That's much more challenging than if I can identify that at 10, 11, 12 weeks of age. So use socialisation as a way to see what the puppy's specific needs are. And it's not about saying that puppy's good, that puppy's not good. It's just about saying, what does this puppy need? Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? And then you can use that as a way to direct where the focus of training, right? The focus of training, we only have limited time, and a lot of people, especially these days, do have limited time to put into training with their puppies. And so if we can say, well, I would like you to really focus, for example, on the manual handling. You need to, this puppy's very touch sensitive. So that's, forget about teaching sit and drop and all those things. We can do that later, right? I want you to focus on the manual handling. That's what good early socialization allows us to do. We do, of course, have to balance early socialization with vaccination protocols. So when we have puppies that are not yet fully vaccinated, there are definitely places and situations that we should be avoiding. That's a conversation for individuals to be having with their vet, but also to be making informed choices about, because isolating puppies until 7 to 10 days after their final vaccination, especially if that final vaccination is at 16 weeks, if we're keeping puppies at home and not going to a lot of effort within the home to provide socialization experiences, we're missing that critical period, right? So it is a balance. We don't want to take unnecessary risk in terms of disease risk and things like that. But there are options to safely socialise and expose puppies, and to try and identify these sensitivities and these predispositions before we're already reaching the end of their critical period of socialisation. So when does socialisation become counterproductive? I'm going to give you a few examples of situations that we want to try and avoid whenever we're socialising puppies. So high arousal, uncontrolled, unstructured interactions with unknown dogs off lead, such as those that take place in off-lead dog parks. I have a fenced off-leash dog park not far from me. It's a very, very busy one. I never go inside, but I will use the fenced dog park for socialisation, for me to stay on the outside, right? And that way I can expose my dogs and puppies to these very real world situations, but I'm maintaining their safety, keeping them on the outside of the fence. I am frequently amazed at the number of people taking puppies and very young dogs into these very high intensity situations. And there are certainly times where I have to move away because I cannot watch anymore. I can see it starting to unravel with puppies that are not coping in that environment. So we want to be avoiding that, especially during critical period socialisation. We also want to make sure that we're not providing experiences that are new or novel with the puppy off lead and at such a distance from us or from the owner that we can't actually guide them, we can't stop them from doing certain behaviours, and we also can't reinforce them, right? So socialisation requires the handler, the owner, to be a very active participant in the socialisation experience. And we'll talk about a couple of specific ways to do that a little bit later this morning as well. We don't want to provide social experiences to a puppy when they're overly excited, very frustrated, rough, or unable to calm down. So those sort of hyperactive interactions where, people might say the puppy's lost it. They've absolutely lost it. What those puppies need in that moment is a redirection of their energy until they're able to regain control. And again, we'll talk about a few ways that we can do that. Before they then come back and have a social interaction with a person, with another dog, whatever the case may be. Frustration probably has the single greatest impact on the development of behaviour issues. So frustration in puppies is something that we should look at as a red flag. We should look at frustration really seriously in puppies and young dogs, instead of it being dismissed as, they're just excited. And I saw this a few weeks ago. I was somewhere, there were a lot of dogs and there were a lot of young dogs on lead, and they were standing around and the owners were having a bit of a chat. Some of the dogs coped well. They were getting a bit bored, but they coped well. And then I watched what happened to some of the puppies as they began to get frustrated. And by the end of the sort of 30 minutes that these owners have been standing around having a chat with their puppies, by the end of that 30 minutes, there were 3 puppies that I was wanting to jump in there and intervene with, because they were becoming so frustrated that they were actually starting to show signs of reactivity, barking, lunging, snapping at the dog next to them. And these things were all coming about because they felt so frustrated. So think about frustration as the pot of water on the stove that overboils, right? Our job in providing social experiences and socialization to our puppies, our job is to regularly empty the pot so that it doesn't overboil, because there's nothing productive to be gained once the pot is overboiling. Then it's just like a rescue mission. And that's what happens with frustration in puppies. So we have to be really on to frustration rather than thinking that it's something that they'll grow out of. They definitely do not grow out of frustration-related behaviours. They tend to get worse over time. We want to make sure that we're not increasing the intensity of exposure when we're socialising, if we're dealing with puppies that are timid, nervous or reserved. So if they're fearful, if they're showing panic responses during socialisation, we might not want to completely remove them in that moment, right? But what we do want to do is immediately decrease the intensity of what's happening, right? So if there are things that are happening around them that are causing them to be fearful, if we can increase the distance from those things without leaving completely, or we can just have the intensity of those things come down, that will be helpful. And a good example of that would be, let's say we've got our puppy in there socialising with a friend or family member's dog, and that friend or family member's dog is getting really excited. Putting that dog on the lead and having them stay in the same room but sit down next to their owner is a good example of how you might decrease the intensity in a socialisation exposure without just grabbing the fearful puppy and removing them completely. Because remember, that's very likely to sensitise them in a situation like that. We want to avoid getting distracted or not concentrating during socialisation experiences. If you get distracted or you're not concentrating, you're going to miss important body language from the puppy about how they feel about what's happening around them. And one of the things that we want to be so mindful of is this idea of flight, freeze, and fight. So most people have heard of fight and flight, but there is another one in the middle there that's freeze, and often dogs will freeze and become immobile just before they take flight or just before they fight. And it's very common in puppy socialization for the puppy to either freeze or to just start taking flight in a very mild way. And we want to be responsive and reactive to that, because what we don't want to do is ignore all of the body language and all of the behaviours that are the puppy's polite way of saying, hey, I'm feeling really overwhelmed here. And then what tends to happen is, if none of those behaviours work to decrease the intensity of the situation, the puppy flicks into rough, right? So they growl, they snarl, they snap, they lunge, they do something else. And then people get reactive, right? So then people respond to that really rapidly. And that's how dogs learn that any avoidant behavior doesn't get a reaction. So they start to lose or eliminate some of those signals. They say, look, well, if averting my eye, turning my head away, looking at the ground, tucking my tail, putting my ears back, if all of these things don't really work to get me the space from something that I desire, well, what else can I do? But if snapping, snarling, growling, lunging, barking gets a response and gets me the space that I want, well, I'll forget about all these avoidant behaviours and just go for the ones that are very effective and make people react very quickly. We also want to make sure that we break down intense experiences. So, for example, sending a puppy to a groomer, we want to prepare the puppy for that. But there's so many things involved in that. And I think groomers do an incredible job with the situations that they're faced with every day, because they're often dealing with dogs that are not prepared for grooming. And just to give you some examples of the way that we might prepare a puppy for grooming is that we break down the grooming process and make sure that the puppy can stand, right? Can they stand? Can they be held in a stand? Can they stand on 3 legs so that we can lift a paw and trim a nail, for example? Can they stand on a table, right? So making sure that they're actually comfortable being up high. For a lot of puppies, the only time that they're on a table is when they're being vaccinated or when they're at the groomer. Can they accept their muzzle being held? right? So that we can be scissoring around faces safely and things like that. Can they accept a brush? Are they comfortable with the noise of a dryer? Are they comfortable to be crated? If they need to be crated at the groomer and they've never been crated before, that's another type of stress. Can they be near other dogs that are moving around them? Because there's usually other dogs in most grooming spaces. So now there's a bunch more things that we would also need to do to be preparatory for the groomer, but that's just a really quick list of things that we would want to start getting young puppies used to, so that by the time they go to the groomer and have that first experience, they're actually as well prepared as what we can make them. And grooming and vet visits kind of work a little bit hand in hand as well. So often when we're doing preparatory work for one, we're actually also helping another as well. So given the importance of all of these things, there are a couple of things that I want owners to do before we start going into very deliberate socialisation exposures. As soon as you bring a puppy home, you're socialising them, you're training them. So there's no getting away from that. But before we start going, right, let's actually take the puppy places or have things come into our environment and do these very deliberate socialisation exposures, there are things that we really want to have done first. So in the first 1 to 2 weeks of bringing a puppy home, these are the things that I would do. So the first thing is that I would condition markers. Now you can use a clicker for it, but I use verbal markers. I just think they're easier, and people always have their voice generally, right? Unless we're unwell, we have our voice, we don't always have a clicker, right? So I prefer owners to condition 2 verbal markers, and verbal markers mean reinforcement is coming. The reason why I want 2 verbal markers instead of just 1 is because I also want 2 different ways to deliver reinforcement. So I teach puppy owners, if you say yes, that means I'm giving you food from my hand. If giving the puppy food from my hand, not the puppy owner. And if I say get it, that means I'm throwing it on the ground. And the reason why I want 2 is because it gives me an ability to feed the puppy close to me and reinforce the puppy close to me and reduce movement. So when you mark with yes and the puppy develops an expectation that yes equals food, right? You say yes, the puppy goes, oh, I'm going to get that from your hand. You hand it to them. That's quite different to when I say get it, and I toss a food reward forward, and I teach the puppy that they can be reinforced away from me, and I also generate movement. So generating movement is really helpful for puppies that either have a lot of energy and we need to put that energy somewhere. So energy is not something that you can just set down in place. If we go back to that pot of boiling water example, you can't just whack the lid on the pot and say don't overboil, right? It'll eventually overboil anyway. So when we use movement with these very energetic, active or drivey kind of puppies, what we're doing is saying put your energy here, put your energy there, right? So if we condition a marker, that not only means you're going to get a food reward, but it also means that you're going to be able to chase, pounce, play as part of that food delivery. It's very helpful. It is also very helpful for the fearful puppies. So for those fearful puppies who tend to want to sit down in place and freeze, it's really useful for them as well. So I want 2 markers. Initially, when we're marking and food reinforcing in socialization experiences, we're not asking for particular behaviours. So I'm not saying to the puppy when I expose them to the vet clinic, for instance, I'm not saying to them, sit. I don't want them to sit. I'm just saying we're going to come into the vet clinic environment and I'm going to go, yes, feed, get it, throw. Right? And I'm just going to teach you that when you're in this environment, lots of really good and fun things happen, and there's no pressure. There's no expectation that you have to do a certain behaviour in order to get the food reinforcement. That comes later, right? So later down the track, having markers gives us the ability to mark specific behaviour during socialisation, but initially we're just marking and reinforcing with no expectation of the puppy's behaviour. We're trying to help the puppy feel a certain way, and that's the beauty of classical conditioning. The puppy will feel, once it's conditioned, once the puppy understands, yes means food, get it means food, thrown. Once they understand those things, then we can actually help the puppy to feel a particular way, to feel good in these situations that we're exposing them to. So those 2 things are very important. We want to do that ahead of time of these deliberate socialisation experiences. I also want the puppy to have been wearing a collar at least 75% of the time. Now, you have to make decisions about whether or not it's safe for the puppy to do so, especially if they're in a multi-dog home. But socialization often requires puppies to be in places where they need to be on a lead, and it is a huge mistake for us to have a puppy that exists naked at home with no collar, no harness, and then we put a collar or we put a harness on them and go, right, now let's go out and do some socialization, because the majority of young puppies will find the feeling of that awkward, or some of them will find it aversive. Some of them will go, actually, this is really quite stressful. So we need to get them used to wearing a collar at home, or if you're choosing to use a harness, you get them used to wearing a harness at home. Much shorter periods for a harness, because harnesses will tend to create friction and rubs in various places. But we don't want the collar or the harness to act as a trigger that elicits fear or adds stress in socialization. Following on from that, we want what I call basic leash yielding. So connecting a lightweight lead to the puppy and walking the puppy around at home and in the yard. I want to teach them that there's no pressure on the collar when they follow me. So when I teach it to humans, I frame it as a follow me exercise. You're clipping a lead on and you're teaching the puppy to follow you, and you're teaching the puppy what happens if they hit the end of the lead, right? Because when you're doing socialization exposures, the chances are they're going to hit the end of the lead at some point. And I don't want the first time or the first half dozen times that they hit the end of the lead to be when I'm simultaneously exposing them to something new or novel, because then I run the risk that we develop an aversion to that new or novel thing. So I introduce that at home. If you don't do that, leash pressure on any kind of collar or harness can add stress, right? All puppies have what we call opposition reflex, and opposition reflex just means that when we have pressure in this direction, right, so we've got a lead moving that way, puppy pulls back the other way. We have to go through that process of teaching the puppy to yield, that when there's pressure, we move in the direction of the pressure and the pressure goes away, right? So that's a really important component that we want to have in place before we're socializing. And finally, teaching the puppy to follow a lure in my hand. And this can go hand in hand with your leash yielding as well. So these things don't all exist in isolation. They kind of feed into each other. We've got condition markers. We've got a puppy that's used to a collar. We've got some basic leash yielding. And then we're teaching the puppy to follow a lure in hand, which gives me the ability to move the puppy where I want them to be rather than wait for them to hit the end of the lead. So I don't want to be sort of taking a backwards seat, right, or a backwards roll where I'm waiting for the puppy to hit the end of the lead and then hoping that the leash yielding work that I've done is good enough. I want to be actually luring the puppy and directing the puppy in these situations where we're doing these socialization exposures. When you generate movement through a lure, not only do you start to kind of add value to the food because you're moving it and you're making it more interesting, but you'll often reduce fight, flight, and particularly freeze behaviours, right, where the puppy just sits down and sits still, which is really important. Owners should also be strongly encouraged to play with puppies. Tug games or interactive retrieve. So when I say interactive retrieves, or sometimes I call it modified fetch, we're not talking about tossing a ball from one side of the yard to the other. We're talking about having a toy, throwing it a metre or two, puppy goes, grabs the toy, we run backwards and puppy brings the toy with energy to us, right? So we're not talking about big, hard games where the puppy is bolting, turning sharply and hurting themselves, right? That's not what we're after. But sometimes modified fetch games are easier for people than tug games, right? Some people find it really difficult to play tug games, but they've got a puppy that actually needs to play. Play is important because it releases energy in the puppy, it reduces frustration, develops engagement with the owner and improves confidence. It improves skills of all kinds when we use it in our training, but particularly those things that require what we call energy transfer. So like a recall, instead of the energy going that way towards, another dog or a puppy, we're calling the puppy back to us and we want them to bring energy to us. So we reinforce in an energetic way. We can use play to develop a usable motivator that we can use in time where food drive wanes, because the problem with food is that even though we use it a lot, but food drive waxes and wanes a little bit. So I don't want to be only dependent on food reinforcement. I want to have, my food reinforcement, but I want to have something else. And particularly when puppies move through adolescence, it is very common for food drive to drop and predatory drive to increase. And so if I'm using some kind of predatory drive reinforcer with these tug or modified fetch games, I've already got something that's in play that I can start to use when they're just not that interested in the food at particular times. And we can also teach puppies how to respond and how to think when they're aroused. So if all training is done when a puppy or a dog is calm, they will not be able to reliably recall that training when they are aroused or excited. So one of the things we must do is make training at some point, not necessarily when we're teaching brand new behaviours, but at some point and pretty early on, right, during critical period socialisation, we have to start adding arousal and adding excitement to training in a deliberate way. If we don't do that, we end up with dogs that when they're calm, they do everything, right? Like they sit, they come, they walk nicely on the lead, they do all these wonderful things. But as soon as you add arousal or excitement, we lose the reliability. When do people most need their training? When the dog is aroused or excited. So we must make sure that training, even with young puppies, starts to actually contain those components. Routine for puppies. So most people tend to follow routines using times of the day, right? So I've frequently been presented with a schedule of what the puppy is doing at different times of the day. I strongly encourage people to be more flexible in terms of their routines. So it depends on the owner's needs and also the puppy's needs on any given day. So thinking about things like, when are you going to need to do some training with the dog on that particular day? We feed meals after that training, rather than having an arbitrary time of, well, the puppy always gets breakfast at 8 a.m. Do we have particular times of the day where the puppy has a lot of energy? Can we add some play into those times so that we're utilising that energy and not expecting the puppy to do something super calm? The only thing that I am a little bit more strict about when it comes to routine, and even then it's based on what the puppy needs on a given day, but opportunities for sleep are very important. So puppies need to not only be able to sleep overnight, right, which is an important thing, but they have to have opportunities for uninterrupted rest or sleep during the day. And this is one of the challenges that we have sometimes in homes with small children, because small children sometimes want to engage with the puppy, and particularly when the puppy is calm, right? When the puppy is maybe lying down on a bed and they're not mouthing or jumping or being overly excitable, those are the times that we have to make sure the puppy does have the opportunity to rest or sleep. I do prefer independent sleep as well, not sleeping in beds with humans for puppies under 12 months of age. If you want to change it later, absolutely fine, go for it. You can do that really easily, but going from a puppy or a dog sleeping on the bed to sleeping independently in an adult dog is much more difficult. And we frequently have people who say, look, I let the puppy sleep on the bed for the first 6 months, but now for a great variety of different reasons, I want the puppy to sleep independently. That's much harder to do it in that direction than for us to say, we're going to create independent sleep through things like crate training or having a bed on the floor that the puppy can sleep on. And then 12 months later, you say, you know what? I'd really like the puppy to be on the bed with me. And provided you have a dog that doesn't have any aggression or resource guarding issues, that's absolutely not a problem at all. And you can certainly move that way. Just a couple more things before we do finish up and have some time for questions. So what to teach, right? So when we've got these baby puppies, we think, well, what to teach? And a lot of people get really focused on skills, right? So I've had puppies that very early on, they're doing all kinds of things. They can sit and they can lie down. They can shake and spin and do all kinds of tricks. For me, I think early stage training should be about communication and establishing communication and relationship building with us, whilst teaching the things that make living with a puppy more enjoyable, because living with a puppy is actually quite challenging sometimes, especially in those early stages. So obedience can be taught at any age, but there are things that we want to start teaching straight away that make living with the puppy much easier. So to do that, we have to have accessible food rewards so that we can reinforce behaviour around the house, not just during specific training sessions. And the other thing that we have is a drag line. So a lightweight lead with the handle cut off, connected to a collar under supervision only, so we don't leave the puppy with it unattended. And we use the drag line so that we can take control of the puppy. Let's say that the puppy goes and starts harassing the other dog and we haven't taught a recall yet. We don't have a good response to their name or anything like that, or maybe they're jumping on the child or they're chewing on furniture. A drag line allows me to actually go and stop the puppy from doing those very self-reinforcing behaviours without me having to physically catch them. Right? Physically catching puppies creates a lot of problems because a lot of puppies then start learning to evade, right? They see hands coming for them. If I can just stand on a lead and then quietly pick it up and move and redirect the puppy, it makes it much easier to manage the puppy in that daily sort of home environment until they've learned to respond to the verbal cues that I need them to. Other things that are really important, independence training. Starting early to identify those puppies that are outside the normal range who need additional help with separation. Separation is not just about the puppy being alone when we actually leave the property and go to work. Things like crate training, multiple types of separation are very useful. Crates, yards, baby gates, internal doors, rooms. We call them micro separations. So having people go into a room, close the door behind them, pick up whatever they went into the room for and then come out again. And so the puppy just learns, well, I don't always have to have access to you, and we're reuniting before there's a lot of stress or anxiety. So these are the things that help to prevent separation anxiety. And they do also aid toilet training as well. We want to work on toilet training early, specifically developing a preference for an organic surface. So we want that surface that the puppy learns to toilet on to be suitable for the length of their life, because preference for surface is very, very hard to change later. So I don't really want for the puppy to learn to toilet on concrete as a puppy if I actually want them to toilet on grass for the rest of their life, right? So that preference for surface, I get very particular about owners taking them to where they want the puppy to toilet early on, and not being slack about that. We've talked about markers. We're going to throw in an additional marker though, because we've got yes and we've got get it. I'm also going to condition a no marker, and that no marker is paired with things like if I go to open the crate door and the puppy goes to barge out, no, and I close the door. Or if I'm going to give a food reward, right? We do this separate from the marker training, by the way, right? From the yes and get it. I offer the puppy a food reward just above their head. If they jump or snatch, no, and I take the food reward away. So I actually start to actively teach the puppy that no means you lose something. And it can be said exactly as I've just said it here. So it's not about, no, and yelling at the puppy or anything like that. But I start to teach them what no means instead of just expecting them to understand on their own. Manual handling, being held and restrained. Now, when you do manual handling with puppies, you can use a lot of inducement to start with, absolutely fine. You can put a pile of food in front of their nose. You can use lick mats and things like that, great things to do. But I also want to do manual handling or restraint without those things, because there will come a day where you need to restrain a puppy without inducement, right? Or they don't care about the inducement anymore. And I want the puppy to understand that when I'm holding you in a position, that if you just relax, everything's fine and wonderful, right? So don't be afraid to actually manually handle the puppy. Ears, paws, mouths. We want to make sure that we're really getting them used to that. And I actually think one world that we can look to for this that does a pretty good job with the manual handling is the dog show world, right? They've got young puppies that are being held and being stacked and being manipulated. And for the most part, exceptions to every rule, for the most part, we've got young puppies and young dogs that are accepting that incredibly well, right? In the pet dog world, people are tending to be very hands-off, right? We've got to be a little bit careful about that. Leash shielding, we've talked about, that's a priority. Leash shielding helps to prevent reactive behaviour in adolescent and adult dogs. We also want to teach a recall. Recalls are about safety, but they're also a symbol of engagement and the relationship that's been developed with the dog. Often the recall around the home is overlooked. So I want to have a dog that if I'm at one end of my house and they're somewhere else, that I can call them and they will come. And that can start to be conditioned very, very early. We turn it into a bit of a game. Puppies think it's wonderful, and we end up with this lovely recall around the house as well as out and about. And then impulse control. So teaching puppies not to jump or mouth when they're aroused. And I think most dogs should have a basic bed stay, a basic go to a bed and stay there, where they are showing self-control when they prefer to be doing something else. So impulse control is not about having those really super laid back dogs that just don't really care about anything. Impulse control is about having the puppy or the dog really want to do something and resist the impulse to do it without frustration, because we've asked or required them to. And that's a really important skill for us to start developing step by step, systematically within puppies, without building fear or frustration, right, as we do that. So things to have, crates. I say crates rather than crate, because having more than one crate I think is really useful. We like crates to have this sort of idea of the portable bedroom, but if it's always in the one location, it doesn't seem to have that same effect for a lot of dogs. Lots of enrichment items, toys, especially for interactive play with us, high value food rewards. I use Prime 100, just cut it up into little pieces. And we've got to have a collar and lead set up ready to go. They're really the things that you need to have to prepare for a new puppy. You don't need a bunch of other extra stuff in those early stages, but they're the things that you want to have before that puppy's stepping through the front door. That's all that I have to get through today. So I would love to hear any questions that we might have.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tamara. That was wonderful. I actually wish I had a new puppy at the moment. I could have taken a lot of tips from my little.
Well, you can always get a new puppy.
Absolutely. All right. So a couple of questions. First one, and I know you've probably answered a few of these questions, but this question's from one of our breeders who couldn't attend. Should I crate train my puppy when I bring him or her home? Is crate training something I should actually do?
Yes, and yes. And the reason why crate training is so important is because it helps with the development of impulse control, and having a safe place for rest and sleep. So, we say crate training is great for one reason. Crate training is great for lots of reasons. So the development of impulse control from a training perspective, I think, is a number one sort of thing. But then we've got all of these other flow-on effects as well. You then have a safe place for rest and sleep that the puppy can go into. It also means that things like going to the vet and having to be crated, going to the groomer and having to be crated, those things suddenly become much less stressful for a dog that's been crate trained. It does also aid toilet training as well, and it creates some flexibility and some safety. So for me, with a baby puppy, I like to have a couple of crates, one up either end of the house. There are a couple of baby gates on doors as well, so that when things are happening in the normal day-to-day, I've got options, and the option is not always to physically separate the puppy completely and put them outside. I think that also it helps puppies to develop this sense of calm when other things are happening around them. And sometimes outside spaces mean that the puppy is not aware of what's happening around them, so they cope quite well when they're outside. But being separated when something's happening right in front of them, they find really difficult. And so introducing that concept that, hey, when you're crated, you just relax, even if there are other things going on around you, is really useful. And it just makes for a much easier, much more flexible day-to-day life, as well as those other benefits.
Yeah, perfect. All right, second question. I work full-time and have just received and just purchased a new puppy. Should I be taking that puppy to doggy daycare, or should I be leaving it home in a safe environment?
Ooh, that is an excellent question. I'd love to know what breed of puppy and what they're able to do with the puppy before and after work. For young puppies, and especially, again, puppies in their critical period of socialisation, I would much prefer that they actually had someone come into the home in the middle of the day to do something with the puppy and spend time with the puppy, rather than go to daycare. There are some dog daycares that do an amazing job, but the environment of a dog daycare can be very overwhelming. And I just think the risk of sensitization, if you're sending them there during their critical period, it's a risk that's too great for me to take personally. And I would wait until they're just that bit older. But if you're working full time and you're away for those long periods, there does need to be something for that puppy during the day. You know, if they're being left alone for 6, 8, 9 hours, that's a really long time for a baby puppy to be left alone, even if the environment is safe and it's enriched and that sort of thing. So I think having someone come into the home, at least during that critical period, is a better option.
Yeah, absolutely. This is going to be one of my favorite ones. I've just bought a new puppy, but I have other pets at home. How do I introduce them?
Yeah, so a lot is going to depend on the existing pets. Have they been around puppies before? Are they pets that are active and mobile, or are they older? Are they pets that are confident in new and different environments, or are they pets that prefer to be at home to feel comfortable and secure? So when you have a multi-dog home and you bring a new puppy in, that need for baby gates and crates and playpens potentially to create separation becomes extremely important. I am a big advocate for depending on the dog that is involved, right? So I'm making the assumption here that the existing dogs in the home do not have aggression issues with other dogs, right? Because then that's a whole different conversation. So let's assume that they are relatively social dogs. Two different ways that I would do it depending on the dog's behaviour and their level of training. I'd either have the existing dog on lead in the yard space, and bring the puppy in. The puppy at that stage, when they're first introduced, is really unlikely to be able to be on lead, right, without being stressed. So usually I'd have the baby puppy off lead and the other dog on lead, and I'd try and move them around the space, right? So I'd move the older dog, hopefully puppy follows, move back the other way, puppy follows, and so on and so forth. And then we assess the body language and we go from there. So there's lots of different divergences that can happen from that point forward, depending on the other dog's behavior, on the existing dog's behavior, and depending on the puppy's behavior. If the puppy is timid and the other dog is boisterous, then they have to actually stay in that managed state for much longer, right? And sometimes it can take weeks, sometimes it can take months to get to the point where they can be off lead in the yard without direct supervision, right? And usually that, for most people, that's their goal, but that does not necessarily happen straight away. The other thing that can happen, so let's say I have an existing dog who it just gets wild when I put the lead on, right? So if I'm going to put their lead on to introduce this puppy, they're just going to be way too aroused. First of all, I'd try and work on that before the puppy arrived, but let's say we didn't have the opportunity to do that. That's where I don't mind a baby gate type situation, right? So we have a room set up, we have a barrier, a see-through barrier, and we have the puppy on one side and the other dog on the other side, off the lead, right? So that we avoid that spike in arousal. They're the two different basic ways that I would do it. It's different when you're introducing an older or fully vaccinated dog, because then you might go out for a parallel walk together, but you can't do that with a puppy, right? The puppy is not, first of all, they're not fully vaccinated, but also they're not going to be able to walk on the lead, and you're going to add a whole lot of stress to the situation. So for baby puppies being introduced to existing dogs in the home, it has to be done in the home, and there are two different ways that you can do it.
Yeah, perfect. Absolutely. I've actually, I really had trouble introducing my puppy to my parrot. So my parrot is very socialized with dogs because of all of my other dogs I've had, but my new puppy just did not get it. So that was very interesting. Last question, Tamara.
So the other thing, so just when you are introducing to other pets, so particularly like cats and birds and things like that, I'd start conditioning straight away with the puppy, and I'd just start conditioning their name usually to begin with. It'd be Freddie, food, Freddie, food, so that I can teach Freddie a recall. That's how we start teaching the recall away from the other pet, right? Is just to start building that association with their name, and that way you start to get a little bit of control around the behavior that they have when they're exposed to that other pet.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. All right, our last question for you, Tamara. Can I over-exercise my puppy? How much exercise is appropriate for a young puppy?
This is such a good question. And this is something I've actually been pondering myself lately because I have a 5-month-old cattle dog. Now, we used to follow this sort of prescriptive advice. It came from a puppy socialization program, and they said 5 minutes per month of age for exercise, right? So if you had a 4-month-old puppy, 20-minute walks maximum, right? That's still followed by a lot of people, is 5 minutes per month of age. I don't think it's a terrible guide. However, I actually think we can end up with a lot of under-exercised puppies. And when you have under-exercised puppies, if you're following that sort of thing, you've still got all this energy that has to go somewhere. So I think the safest thing to do is to look for signs of fatigue. And the reason why I like this better is because it means you're looking at the individual puppy on a specific day, because signs of fatigue, like fatigue's going to vary, right? There are going to be days where your puppy seems to have endless energy, and it makes sense that they need more exercise on those days. There's also going to be times where they don't have that energy, and you don't want to be giving the same amount of exercise on those days, right? So look for signs of fatigue. Now, fatigue is not, we're looking for early signs of fatigue. Early signs of fatigue are things like the puppy becomes less responsive to you. They become less motivated, right? It's not once we're getting to the point where their tongue's hanging out of their head and they're collapsed on the ground like that. We've gone way past the point of fatigue if we're getting to the point where the puppy can't stand up anymore, right? And they just collapse on the ground. I think the type of exercise is extremely important. There is a massive difference between going somewhere and having, like, a common thing that we might do with our puppy. We've got some bushland sort of areas, they've got walking tracks through them, and we might put her on a long line and amble through there. Now, we might amble through there for 45 minutes, right? And to me, that's absolutely fine. That's totally different to going down to the dog park and having your dog, or your young dog or your puppy, run doing sprints, sharp turns, and sudden stops with other dogs or with balls. They're the things that can be very problematic for growing bones, joints, and ligaments. I have a really good client who's a dog physiotherapist, and she would agree that sort of long-range ball throwing or play with other dogs where we're doing those sorts of movement patterns, that's what's problematic. So it's not just about the length of exercise, it's about the type of exercise. We also want to avoid jumping down from anything of height, right? Jumping out of the back of the car, jumping off the couch, right? Those sorts of things are more problematic for bones, joints, and ligaments. Slippery floors, right? So even though we need to get them used to it a little bit from a socialization point of view, but you do not want a puppy that's bolting up and down on a slippery floor, even for 2 minutes, right? Even for 30 seconds, they bolt, slip, slide into the wall, right? That's problematic exercise for puppies that are still growing. It's probably problematic even for adult dogs, but think about the surface that they're on, think about the type of movement patterns that they're doing, and think about fatigue more than an arbitrary time limit, because I think arbitrary time limits, they might work fine for some of your lower energy puppies and lower energy young dogs. But if you give those arbitrary time limits to your cattle dog, which is what I've got, your cattle dog or your German Shepherd or something, and you're saying, well, I can't exercise them for more than 15 minutes, you might end up with a very frustrated, very energetic puppy, and that energy is going to go somewhere, and it usually goes into inappropriate behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. Well, that is us for today, Tamara. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time and your knowledge. I'm sure everyone's absolutely enjoyed the time. I mean, I could sit here all day and listen to you, so thank you very much.
You're so welcome.
I'll send a copy out to everyone for the live webinar, and yeah, thank you so much. Take care.
No problem. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.